Okay, grade five. So welcome back to our first, not our first, but our last social studies PowerPoint. Today we're going to talk about First Nations. I wanted to have a small introduction about what it means to be First Nations today, because last time we talked about the Métis Rebellion. So it's important at least to have an introduction. You will not have a complete, like course about First Nations. This is just an introduction, so don't expect to have the whole information. If you want more information, you can go and do some research if you're interested. Okay, so First Nations today. First Nations. So what are the objectives? First one, it's what does it mean to be First Nation? Two, are there more than one language? Is there more than one language? So maybe First Nations speak one or maybe more. And demographics, where do they live? More specifically, in Canada. So First Nations, what does it mean? So it means, as a general information, people of native tribes who lived in Canada before Europeans came there. So that means all of those who lived before Europeans came to the country, not the country, but the actual territory. They're called First Nations because they were the first to be there, and they are nations as well because they speak different languages, they have different customs, they have different kind of dances, different kinds of they eat different foods, so they're being called nations. So First Nations. Second, well, First Nations have many cultures, and some of the cultures are very different from others. That's exactly what I said. So we have different nations, but it depends on which nation you live in. Well, the culture is completely different. It could be completely different. And other names. Well, other words that have been used for First Nations people such as Indigenous, Aboriginal, Indian, Native Indian, Amerindian, or Native. So there are different kinds of words that we use to describe First Nations, but the best one is either First Nations people or Indigenous people. Very important to know that we do not, it is very important not to use this word anymore, to use the word Indian, because the word Indian could be seen as something that is not really well accepted into the Indigenous or First Nations communities, because Indian is used for people who live in India. Okay? Le mot indien, c'est pour les personnes qui vivent en Inde, mais pas pour les Premières Nations, les autochtones. You have to be careful not to use the word Indian anymore. We used to call them that way because first settlers thought they were in India at the beginning. Donc on les appelait les Indiens parce qu'au moment lorsque les colonisateurs sont arrivés dans le nouveau territoire, ils ont rencontré les Premières Nations et ils croyaient qu'ils étaient rendus en Inde parce qu'en ce moment, l'idée c'était de se rendre en Inde. Ils faisaient le tour du monde pour se rendre de l'autre côté, puisque la Terre est ronde, de se rendre en Inde. Lorsqu'ils sont arrivés ici dans le nouveau territoire, ils croyaient qu'ils étaient en Inde et ils ont appelé les personnes des Indiens, croyant qu'ils étaient en Inde. Et c'est pour ça qu'on appelle, exemple, petite parenthèse, c'est pour ça qu'on appelle aujourd'hui le blé d'Inde, parce qu'on croyait que c'était un blé qui se faisait pousser dans le pays de l'Inde. Mais ça ne fonctionne plus maintenant. It doesn't work anymore. We do not call them Indians. We call them either First Nations or Indigenous people. Okay, so which languages? Well, sometimes we think that First Nations have one language, but actually there are many languages. Today there are over 30 different languages, 30 différentes langues, 30 different languages spoken by Indigenous people, most of which are spoken only in Canada. Many are in decline. Donc, beaucoup de ces différentes langues qu'on parle, plus de 30 qu'on parle, on les parle dans approximativement toute l'Amérique du Nord. Ça comprend aussi les États-Unis et le Canada, mais il y a certaines langues qu'on parle seulement au Canada. Plusieurs de ces langues, sont en voie de disparition aussi. Il n'y a pas assez de personnes qui les parlent maintenant. Plutôt, on parle soit le français ou l'anglais. So here we have examples of different languages and more specifically where those languages are being spoken. So first of all, we have the Inuktitut. So it is called in it is speak in Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. We have another example that is the Inuinnaqtun that is spoken in Nunavut. The Chipewyan, I have difficulty saying this one. Chipewyan in Western Canada. The Cree language related to the Algonquin language and the Northwest Territories to Labrador. So we speak those specific languages in those territories. We have the Inuvik, the Inuit language. It's spoken in the Northwest Territories and in Nunavut. And then we have the North and South Slavey, spoken in the Northwest Territories. And finally, we have this one that I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. Well, no, I'm not gonna pronounce that one because I don't know how it is pronounced. But this language just right here, it's spoken in the Northwest Territories. Those are the most important ones. And as you can see, they're all completely different. So French and English are not the only languages that are being spoken in Canada. So you really need to understand that language, even if we are in Canada and we say that the official language is English or French, English and French, sorry, because Canada is a bilingual country, well, we still have 30 different languages. And those languages are from those who were born here and who are actually descendant from the old nations, the First Nations in the country, even before Canada existed. So we must understand that First Nations are still very important. We live in a country where the territory was actually in possession of First Nations. We are some kind of guests, on est plutôt des invités, and we are here for different reasons of story, but we really need to understand that this is not our land in a sense. Ceci n'est pas notre territoire, on est plutôt ici, on s'est installé. Okay, so it's very important to take into account that First Nations have their own languages and they're very important today. Well, what are the demographics? I'm going to talk a little bit about where do they live, and that is going to be the last part. So there are distinct First Nations in Canada, originating across the country. Indian reserves, and as you can see, I put this in red because we don't call them anymore Indian, because sometimes you can see this word in you can see this word in some websites. I use it to show you that Indian is not very well done. So in this sense, we should say Indigenous reserves or First Nations reserves are the very limited contemporary lands of First Nations recognized by the non-Indigenous governments. So you have in Canada what we call Indigenous reserves. In those specific places, people who come from First Nations communities or they live in specific places, all right? They do not have a province. They do not have like a city. We call them reserves because we don't want people to go into that specific place and change things. So Indigenous people live in those places with their own costumes, their own languages, and their own, probably sometimes they change their education and they don't follow the provincial education, all right? So today, Aboriginal people work in a variety of occupations and live outside their ancestral homes. The traditional cultures of their ancestors, shaped by nature, still exert a strong influence on the culture, from spirituality to political attitudes. So Indigenous people or Aboriginal people, some of them don't live anymore in their native land. Ils n'habitent plus dans leur terre ancestrale, ils habitent plutôt dans les grandes régions, dans les grandes villes. Ils habitent à l'extérieur de leur terre ancestrale. Mais ils continuent à exercer leur propre culture, leurs propres coutumes, et dépendamment où est-ce qu'ils se retrouvent, ben, ils vont vraiment s'adapter à qu'est-ce qu'il y a autour. Il y a quelque chose de très important, c'est de savoir que leur terre ancestrale était très importante, ou encore elle est très importante, parce que c'est grâce à la nature et grâce à ses ancêtres que leur culture a été faite. Et c'est grâce à cette connexion avec leur territoire que la partie spirituelle est très forte dans dans les communautés indigènes. Il y a une certaine connexion que nous, on n'a pas nécessairement parce que nous, on n'a pas eu cette connexion avec la terre qui nous entoure. On n'a pas eu la même éducation et on ne comprend pas exactement comment fonctionnent euh, les, euh, les Premières Nations en termes d'agriculture, de mode de vie, parce que certaines réserves ou euh, certaines communautés peuvent vivre d'une autre façon complètement différente à nous. Alors, c'est très important de savoir que les Autochtones ou les Premières Nations vivent partout au Canada. Ils peuvent se retrouver dans des réserves, mais aussi ils peuvent se retrouver dans des grandes villes ou dans d'autres régions. Mais ils gardent toujours très forte leur coutume et leur culture parce qu'ils veulent vraiment survivre à tout ce qu'il y a autour. Et lorsque je dis survivre, when I say that they need to survive, is because English and French it's very present today. They don't want to lose their language. And at the same time, we have our Western culture. On a notre culture vraiment est très nord-américaine, qu'on parle de la musique, qu'on parle de la façon qu'on parle de la technologie, qu'on parle de valeurs spécifiques. Alors, les Premières Nations essayent de toute façon de garder leur culture et leur coutume vivante pour pouvoir survivre et ne pas disparaître. All right, guys, so it was nice to give you a little bit of an introduction about First Nations, and I hope the next year we'll have more time to talk about dances, dances, culture, and some interesting things about how First Nations live and why it's so important to take into consideration that they are the First Nations in Canada. All right, so have a nice day and see you soon.